When I was a student at Fort Lewis College, I had an opportunity through student government to work in Washington, D.C. I acted as a lobbyist, talking to our representatives about causes and legislation that I believed in. I loved this job, but I was awful at it. As someone who loves statistics and data, I thought the data would speak for itself. I thought the moment these representatives heard these statistics, it would be a done deal. I was sure that it wouldn't be an issue. But what they forgot to tell me when I was training for this was that data doesn't go as far as we think it does in legislation. Because someone could come in after me and use that same data to tell a very different story, to paint a very different picture, one of why this legislation shouldn't go through. These representatives hear statistics all day, every day, used to paint different pictures and advocate for different causes. And after a while, we forget the statistics. We forget the data. What we remember are the stories. I realized that although other people could use my data, they could never tell my story. They could never speak to how I would be impacted by this legislation, how my community would be, and talk about the emotion behind it. That was something the representative would never hear again, was my story. And in life, much like in lobbying, statistics are very important, but they only go so far. Our stories are what matter. When we talk about our stories, we talk about something that's unique to us that only we can talk about. And when we're able to combine the data with the stories, they have impacts that last far longer than any one statistic could. So my name is Al, and today I'll be discussing how to incorporate storytelling into your life through emotion, vulnerability, and connection to ensure that your story goes far beyond Fort Lewis. I know some of you might be wondering right now, I'm an engineering major. Why is storytelling relevant to me, right? Put simply, stories stick with us. I mean, really, biologically, they do. When we tell a story with emotion, and that makes us feel connected to the person presenting or to the environment around us, it sticks in our brains longer and it's easier to retrieve long term. If you want your data to have an impact beyond this auditorium, you need to tell a story. A lot of people think that in storytelling we have to omit the data to combine the narrative. But that's not true, it's the opposite. We combine them for a greater impact. I mean, think about TED Talks, right? We don't watch them just for the data. We watch them to hear their stories. We watch them to connect. We watch them to understand why they care and why we should. And when you're writing your own story, you can and should start with thinking about your why. Why do I care? What motivates me to continue doing this work? Why is this significant to me? What impact do I hope this has on others? We don't choose senior research projects that bore us. We don't want to write 20-page papers on something we don't care about. You care about this. Why do you care? Go beyond just why you chose it, why it interests you, and talk about why you care. We can't tell an authentic story without stopping to consider that. And just like in lobbying, you're the only one who's the expert on why you're telling this story. You are the only one who can speak to that. And when you talk about your why, it makes it clear to others why they should care. When I was a student, as Ben mentioned, I had the opportunity to give a TED Talk as my senior research project. Here's how I represented my why. If someone's scared of snakes, show them snakes. If someone's scared of failure, make them do stand-up comedy. At least this is the conclusion I came to after years of not responding to traditional treatments for my anxiety disorder. After going to therapy nearly every week since the age of 16, trying a handful of different medications, and downloading every meditation podcast I could get my hands on, I started to feel like a lost cause. My debilitating anxiety attacks were happening daily and easily overshadowed any progress I was making in therapy. I needed relief, and I needed it quickly. Knowing that my anxiety was fueled by a fear of failing and not wanting to wait another month to see if a different medication would help, I took what some would consider a drastic step. I started pursuing stand-up comedy. The surprising thing is, it worked. Regularly giving myself opportunities to fail through stand-up made me acknowledge my capacity for resiliency, appropriated failure within my own life, and got me to a place where I could really begin to cope with my anxiety disorder. At the age of 20, I began using comedy as exposure therapy to failure. Today, on what is actually my 24th birthday, I'll be discussing the potential of comedy as a therapeutic tool and the healing impact of embracing failure. So most of us are familiar with feeling anxious. It's inevitable and usually occurs around specific stressors. Big job interviews, final exams, realizing you're getting pulled over. I want you to think about 2 different lectures you've attended. The first as something boring, one that you could barely stay awake during, you couldn't pay attention during, that left you wanting to take a nap after, right? And then the second one, I want you to think about a lecture that you left feeling excited, that you wanted to learn more, you wanted to keep hearing about it. So talk for just a few minutes with the people next to you about the difference between those 2. All right, it sounds like we're starting to quiet down a little bit. Does anybody want to share really briefly the difference between the 2? That's okay. I'm the one speaking, I guess I'll do it. I'm going to venture to guess that the boring one was really flat, right? That it was just the facts, it was nothing beyond that. It didn't make us think about anything beyond what was on the page in front of us. And I'm going to guess that the exciting one, the one that got us thinking about it, that made us want to learn more, was a story. It connected us to the past or the future. It went beyond what was on the page and got us invested. If the professor was excited or was upset about what was going on with it, that gets us invested. The difference between the 2, when we narrow it down, is emotion. There is emotion in everything. And I don't just say that because I have a degree in psychology. There's emotion all around us, and it's important. It's a signal to our brains that what we're experiencing is important and needs to be remembered to a degree. It makes our stories stick. And I want to be clear, when I say emotion, I don't want you to try to make your audience cry, right? I can't leave a lobbying visit with my representative feeling like he just watched Titanic. Emotion in storytelling means going beyond the facts, not just talking about what's in front of you, but what could be and what it feels like. When we understand our emotions, when we communicate them, we allow our audience to understand not only our why, but start diving into our how. With an anxiety disorder, such as my diagnosis of generalized anxiety disorder, the intensity of anxious feelings are disproportionate to the situation. A situation like getting pulled over can lead me to an anxiety attack, where my symptoms move far beyond those of feeling anxious. My heart starts to beat so rapidly out of my chest, I'm sure cardiac arrest is imminent. My hands start to tingle and go numb. I start to hyperventilate, gasping for air, thinking there's no way my body's receiving the oxygen it needs to function. And you guys, you know what? You're in for a real treat today, because I just forgot what I was saying, and you're seeing a real-life example of failure! Okay! All right, let's get back to the real stuff. Okay, who felt a little on edge when I described what anxiety feels like? Right? Who felt really nervous when I forgot what I was saying? That makes 2 of us, right? And who felt relieved when I got it together? When we have these moments of vulnerability and emotion, it brings connection through empathy. Emotion in storytelling is not just talking about the past, what these emotions used to feel like. It's grounding them in the present. It's being vulnerable enough to allow them to see these emotions in action. That clip was vulnerability for me. I wish I could say that was staged. It was not. It was definitely my worst fear going into that talk, and it happened. And what it didn't show, what's even more vulnerable, is admitting that the magic of editing cut out 30 more seconds of me walking around on that red circular rug trying to find my place. They offered to cut that part out entirely, but I asked them not to, because I think that honesty and imperfection creates empathy. It furthers these connections. It makes us all think, what if that was me? We've all had those dreams where we get on stage and we're supposed to be in a play and we forget everything we're supposed to say. That was just my reality. But it's vulnerable in that it's relatable. And I'm not saying that I seek out all these opportunities to be vulnerable just to connect with people, right? In fact, in the first draft of this speech, I realized I hadn't included a single story. I hadn't included a single emotion, a single vulnerable moment. And although irony is a really powerful thing in storytelling, it was not my intention. Even when it's our whole purpose, vulnerability is terrifying. Without vulnerability, though, we don't have this connection to everyone that we want to. We might assume that in these emotions, we're the outliers, that we are the ones that are wrong. But when we can relate through these difficult times and these difficult experiences, we can start to create purpose in them and go beyond what's in front of us to see what's ahead. At the time I started utilizing exposure therapy, my feared stimuli were public speaking and failure. So stand-up seemed like a perfect fit. When you begin to look at how defined comedy is by failure, using it as exposure therapy to failure starts to make sense. Failure is an inevitable part of comedy. In fact, you need failure to succeed at comedy. Because if a joke doesn't go over well, there's usually a reason. Your physical presentation, the delivery of your punchline, the structure of your jokes. Often comedy forces you to immediately acknowledge the role you played in failing. And in this case, failure can directly lead to improvement. But sometimes within comedy, you're not responsible for a joke not going well. And you have to consider that factors outside of your control cause you to fail. The audience wasn't ideal. They didn't feel comfortable laughing loudly. The lineup of the show, the night of the week, the sound system, or even the temperature of the room can turn a good set into a bad one. And in this case, failure simply is. It highlights the overarching inevitability of failure. But part of the success of comedy as a genre is that unless you're regularly attending amateur open mics, you don't see the failure that's so characteristic of it. We see the Netflix specials, but we miss the 40 city tours leading up to them, where the same jokes that killed the night before bomb in front of a slightly different audience. We think some people are just naturally that funny, without seeing the notebooks full of shamefully unusable jokes. Comedians practice the cadence and delivery of a joke over and over until we get it just right, which means over and over, we're met with reactions we didn't want or expect. I knew that failure would not only be inevitable, but welcome and expected within stand-up comedy. A phrase new comedians hear often is pay your dues, meaning you have to do these awful shows where you're probably not going to succeed because it's what we've all had to do. You have to earn it. So new comedians seek out stage time to improve even when we know it will lead to failure. A few years ago, I took a gig performing between a DJ and a famous rap group. It did not go well. I wound up getting booed off stage and replaced by a hula hoop contest. But even at the time, that wasn't a gig I expected to go well, because I knew they'd chosen me, a gay feminist with mostly clean material, to open for a notoriously misogynistic rap group. But stage time is stage time. Because it takes time to work up to bigger gigs, comedy made graded exposure therapy very realistic. I started small, with a 3-minute set at an open mic where I read my jokes word for word off of a piece of paper in front of me. I remember speaking at about the same volume as the paper shaking in my hands, stuttering over my words, losing my place, and feeling so scared of people seeing me fail, I don't think I looked up once. In retrospect, my first set was awful, but it didn't feel that way. And maybe that was the pride of probably prematurely feeling like I could claim the title of comedian, or just knowing I did something I didn't think I could. For the first time in years, I felt seen as something more than someone with anxiety. So I kept going. A few weeks later, I moved on to 5-minute sets where I had detailed notes about my jokes hiding on the stool in front of me. At this point, I started to notice my focus shifting. Shifting from the fact that I had failed to the fact that I was becoming a part of a community where failure was a rite of passage. A few months after that, I started doing 10-minute feature spots where I just had the titles of jokes written on my hands, and eventually wound up doing 30-minute headlining spots with my sets memorized. Some of the most significant moments of my life have been created through comedy. I even came out as gay on stage in 2017. But this is not a story of how I overcame all my fears, broke the rules, and effortlessly obtained huge success in comedy. I still fail at comedy all the time. And if you saw me perform last Thursday night, you know that to be fact. But for the first time in years, I found something I loved, where the enjoyment didn't come from being the best. It came from doing it over and over, even though over and over, I was terrified.
When we're vulnerable, we connect to each other. And when we think about our why and tell our stories, we connect to our purpose. When we connect to a version of ourselves who's purposeful in not just conveying, but creating stories, we connect to our future. Your story is worth telling. And I encourage you today to not only think about how you'll tell your story, but how you'll create it. Our stories stick with us. So above all else, create them, seek them out, and make them count. Thank you.